What would we know without journalists and their stories? Yeah, 27 years of being a journalist, I'm really interested in this. They or we are your eyes and ears taking the time to do the research. And this next panel is going to focus on the role that the media plays in shaping our actions and our reactions with respect to climate change. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the next session. It's Dale Willman, who is an Associate Director for Resilience Fellowship Program at the Columbia Climate School. Come on up, Dale. Come on up. Let's give him a round of applause. How are you? Good, good. You can take that seat right over there. He is joined by Dr. Kurt Steger and Emily Russell. Come on up. How you doing? Good to see you. Hi there, how are you? Dr. Steger is an ecologist, a paleoclimatologist, and science journalist with a PhD in biology and geology from Duke University. He's published in Science and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Kurt has also written extensively for general audiences in periodicals such as the National Geographic, the New York Times, Fast Company, and Adirondack Life. Since 1990, he has also co-hosted Natural Selections, which is a weekly science program on North Country Public Radio that is syndicated internationally. Growing up in Glens Falls, New York, Emily Russell has deep roots in the area. Welcome back. She got started in public radio in Alaska before moving back to the North Country, where she now covers the Adirondack State Park for North Country Public Radio. And so I will turn it over to you, and you have your microphones and everything? All righty, great.
I don't hear a thing. There we go.
There we go.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Dale Willman. I'm really excited to see you all here today. And I always hate being the last panel before lunch, so I hope that your stomachs don't growl too much and you can stay with us through this. I work at Columbia University, as he said, and I conduct trainings on resilience science for journalists. I also have spent more than 20 years working for NPR, where I work as a newscaster today. And my focus has been on environmental journalism. So we've already had the introductions of Kurt and Emily, so I'll let that go by. But right now, I'm going to give just a quick opening comment because I think it gives some context that will be important for the conversation we're having. So there's a connection between what we've been talking about today and the 1950s and tobacco that you may not be aware of. The first scientific study that showed a clear connection between tobacco and cancer was around 1951. Within a year, the tobacco industry created a structure, an institution that began to challenge that kind of information that was out there. And they found that they didn't need to necessarily, over years of testing, they didn't necessarily need to come up with a lot of studies, but what they needed to do was cast doubt on the studies that were out there. So for the next 30 or 40 years, people were dying of cancer from smoking, and the tobacco industry kept saying, well, that's really not us. It's really not linked to us. Now, the connection with that, and the reason why it's so important, is that around the late 1970s, early 1980s, people started talking about human-influenced climate change. And they picked up the same playbook. And in fact, they picked up some of the same people. They hired some of the same people that did this for the tobacco industry and quickly began sowing doubt about climate information, about climate science that was out there. And that's pretty important. So my point of this is to understand how the public has essentially been duped. And we're going to talk a bit about the journalist's role in that and the way journalism covers climate now. But initially in the 80s and 90s, what you saw in journalism was a very strong effort toward balance. And that balance equated to 50% of the story to those who say humans are causing changes in the climate, and then 50% of those who said it wasn't. Now, this is, of course, a false sense of balance, which we know even more so today. But what that did was cast doubt and allow people to have that little thing in the back of their heads that said, well, maybe this isn't really happening. Maybe I don't need to change behavior. Maybe I don't need to worry about my lifestyle and jetting all around the world. And so that started in the 80s, so what were we, 30, 40 years into that, and now people are finally starting to see these connections. And what happened in the meantime is these industries were able to capture a lot of profit. Now, you only need to turn to NPR last night, who was talking about Exxon. I don't know if you saw the story, but Exxon, it's finally come out that their own research showed decades ago that fossil fuels were helping to destroy the planet. Their own research said that, and yet they continued to obfuscate. They continued to sow doubt. This is what's happened for many, many years, and we've all been complicit in the sense that we've happily gone along with that doubt that's created, many of us, and allowed things to get worse. So that's an important thing to put into context about what we're talking about today. So I want to start with you, Emily, and talk. Now, you haven't done climate exclusively, but you've been involved in environmental reporting for a very long time. I'm certain much of your work in Alaska was about that. But what has changed in the way that you cover from when you first started covering these issues?
Yeah, so I've only been a journalist for about 7 years, so not that long. But getting started in Alaska was a really fascinating place to begin my journalism career. I started in Nome, Alaska, which is this really small community on the edge of the Bering Sea. And I wasn't, and I'm still not, a climate reporter, but the reporting we were doing there was about the people and their lives. And what was happening out there is the sea ice is getting thinner. It's getting harder to go walrus hunting because it's just less safe. You can't travel up the frozen rivers in the winter because the ice is not thick enough. And it's continuing obviously to happen today. But so what I learned in Alaska was really that covering climate change was really just covering people's lives. And I think that was changing. It's changed over the last 10 to 20 years, where climate change used to be a conversation just about science and about data and about polar bears, right? And I think it's changed in the last decade, and I've seen that in my short career so far, where we're now not just talking about the people in far off places in the Arctic, which is where I was, or in island nations, but we're now talking about people underwater in California, and we're talking about warmer winters here in the Adirondacks. So as a reporter, I've approached my reporting, as I always do, from a personal perspective. I look for stories about people, and if I want to do a climate story, which I did one about a week or two ago from Old Forge, which, if you're not from the area, it's a couple hours away from here, this kind of snowmobile mecca in the Adirondacks. They get a lot of snow, or at least they used to. And they built this, winter tourism season around the snow and around snowmobiling. And that, a couple of weeks ago, it was 40 degrees. I was in Old Forge walking through slush, and the trails were completely bare. And this is their livelihood out there. So my approach to telling stories about climate change is really centered on people and businesses and their culture and how it makes them feel. And as a consumer of news too, I find those stories more compelling and more maybe convincing to folks who continue to deny the reality that climate change is real and it's impacting all of us. Everybody in this room is impacted by climate change. So that is my approach to covering climate change.
And I want to get to that issue of denial. We'll talk to that in a little bit. And I should have mentioned, please save up your questions. We hope to have some time at the end for some questions. But I've been a member for a long time of the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is a group that has about 1,400 members. And one of the big discussions in that for years was, how can we get our editors to pay attention to our stories? One of the issues is exactly what you've defined there, is that when it's about climate and science, editors say, well, we did that 6 months ago. We don't need to do another climate story. And this has been a problem for a long time. And one of the issues is that the pathway to being a gatekeeper, I don't know if you guys know that term, but it's the person who stands by the gate and decides what news is reported and what isn't. It's a very important role, and that's usually the editors. And the normal path to be an editor does not go through the science desk. It goes through the politics desk. So when you get frustrated at the news you see and think, wow, they're covering everything like a horse race, that's why, because that's how politics is covered, is in a horse race fashion. But the climate, the environment, any of those issues shouldn't be covered in that way. So one of the most important ways to get around that to some extent is to cover climate not as a climate story. So when you go to your editor, what do you pitch a story? If you were to pitch a story, Kurt, what would you pitch it as?
Well, I'm coming at this from a problem of classifying myself. I'm mostly a scientist, but also I do a lot of outreach and I suppose journalism. And I've seen the transition in the science community, actually, where we focused until about 20 years ago on really confirming the human role in the warming that we're seeing. We're finding out that yes, it's real, and yes, it's us, and yes, it's here. So that was a lot of work. And so the heavy lifting has been done in that. Now what we're trying to switch over to is what are the impacts of that and where's it gonna head in the future? And that leads naturally, I think, to a meshing with the journalism culture over the time period Emily's talking about too, because those stories, I think, engage people a lot more than just the straight up science nerds. And so I've had a lot more success getting op-eds out or having a meaningful interview with somebody in the media who does contact me as a scientist if I can relate it to stories like the Old Forge thing, which is a fantastic story. You walk into this visitor center that Emily told me about. I actually now have the data and I can use them scientifically. But there's a visitor center. Maybe you could describe this a little bit. You walk in and right before your eyes are the measurements from how far back?
Yeah, it went back to the 1960s. It was this really amazing moment. I spent the whole day out reporting, talking to business owners, snowmobilers, and then I think it was one of the last interviews. I walk into this visitor center in Old Forge, and I talk to the tourism director. We talk for 20 minutes, get this great interview, and as I'm heading out the door, this guy says, "Oh yeah, and we've got all these measurements going back to the 1960s, all on the wall. It's got snowfall totals every single year." And he talked me through it, and back in the 1960s, they'd get 400 inches of snow in one winter. And in the last few years, it's been about 85 inches. And it varies, it's sometimes 150, but it's definitely, you can see it with your eyes that the snowfall total has dropped. And Kurt was in my story, and I went to him for an interview and told him about this board, and so he was actually able to translate that data and show it in a different way to show that it is happening. They are getting less snow, and that was a really impactful data set that you created from that.
Well, and it's interesting too. John Erickson at the University of Vermont, who's an ecological economist, has done presentations for me at workshops I've done, and he has this thing that he calls changing baselines. And you guys have probably all seen those photos from the charter trips in Florida, where people are standing by the board and they're holding up their catch and smiling happily. And he shows a photo from about the 1960s. And what you have is maybe 10, 15, like 6 foot, I don't know what they're, tuna or whatever they are, and everybody's really happy. And then in the 70s, it's a larger number, maybe 15, but maybe fish 4 feet long. And where to now, it's 20 fish, but they're maybe 1.5 feet, 2 feet long. And the idea is changing baselines. So if you're familiar with what the catch was like in the 60s, you're outraged about what it's like now. If you're younger, if you don't have that early baseline, then the change is more incremental for you. And this is what that exhibit does, is it shows that changing baseline. And that's pretty important for the work that you do.
Yeah. People respond to things that they live among rather than charts and data usually, right? So I get a lot of my information from stories of people who live in the area, some of whom might not agree that climate change is real or that it's caused by people. People keep track of when the ice leaves the lakes around here. Like on Mirror Lake, there's an ice out contest, and Lake Placid, and there was one at Paul Smith's College where I work for years. And so we have these data, and the data are accurate because there's money riding on it, because people are gambling, right? And they use that themselves to do informal studies. And so it's really undeniable for folks who live here who will remember, for example, on Lake Champlain, there used to be ice fishing shanty villages on the ice of Lake Champlain between Plattsburgh and Burlington. And it was always entertaining. I see some heads nodding, some of you may remember. In the spring, when the ice would start to thin out, there were always folks who would never leave on time. And so the ice would break off with them on their shanties. and talk about journalism. I mean, it was always so entertaining to watch them on the news getting rescued and things like that. Well, that doesn't happen anymore because the lake is not fully frozen in the middle. And we all see that, and the ferry operators see it too. So that, I think, is the most impactful stuff. So even if you maybe don't want to talk about global warming, you can at least talk about winter is changing here and we all see it.
I was in Kotzebue in Alaska last year and talking to some of the elders about this, and one of their biggest issues is being out on the sea ice in the wintertime and how many more of them end up going through the ice. They have 2 or 3 people that go through the ice when that never happened before, because the places that they knew that their whole history had told them was solid and safe suddenly isn't. 2 things I forgot to mention, by the way, because I didn't do the introductions, but Kurt is not only an amazing scientist and an incredible teacher, which I witnessed, and he is amazing, but in a previous life, he also wrote for National Geographic, so he's a perfect scientist to have on this panel. And Emily with North Country Public Radio is, in my estimation, as someone who's been with NPR for 20 years, probably the best public radio station in the system, and they do amazing work. But it's a changing baseline. If you grew up here, you don't know just how good they are, but come down toward me, towards Saratoga, and you'll notice the difference. Those of you who know what I'm talking about are all laughing, yes. Sorry, but phenology is what you're talking about, this long-term data collection that birders do, that gardeners do, is really valuable information. I wish news outlets, I wish North Country Public Radio would do this, would have a section on the website dedicated to phenology so people could go back and see this. Henry David Thoreau, as you know, was very famous for his readings and his documenting the natural world around him, and climate scientists began using his work because it was robust enough that they could begin to compare it to what's happening today in that same area. So phenology in this collection of data is very important. But to get back to where we were about the different ways of covering climate in ways, and so I'll bring out the whole denial thing too, and there's still climate deniers out there. In Miami, there was a collection, I don't know if they're still doing it, but the public radio station, the Miami Herald, some other organizations formed a collaboration to cover climate. And one of their unspoken rules was you don't talk about climate, you talk about sea level rise. Because everybody there believes in sea level rise. They just don't believe in what's causing it. And we have to understand this is a belief system, not a fact-based system. But that happens in many places. So when we talked about climate and the way you're talking about the way people live, climate stories are often a lot of other things. They're health stories. I'm sure you've reported on some stories involving health that have a climate component, but you don't have to talk about climate. It's also a business story. There are many business stories. I mean, the changing, as we heard in the panel this morning, and what this whole conference is about, saving snow, is how climate is affecting the business of snow and of winter sports. So, Kurt, you're a really good communicator of science information. How do you get that message out? How do you talk about this in terms that you think people who may not otherwise listen will pay attention?
So I should say, by the way, I know a lot of you appreciate these folks. You hear them on the radio a lot. But when they do a really good job on a story and it gives you an emotional jolt, I hope you realize that it's not just an automatic natural thing they were born with. They learn how to do this. It takes training and skill to do what these people do. And most of us don't have it. So I've been really, really lucky to be brutally trained by my co-host at North Country Public Radio, Martha Foley. Over 30 years of these weekly nature programs I did, they're 3 to 4 minute conversations about the natural world. And she would just stop me in the middle of the conversation and say, wait, can you say that in plain English? So I've been trained by her, the editors at National Geographic, New York Times.
Which is embarrassing when you're live on the air.
Fortunately, we tape them in advance. But then it fed back to my teaching and all that and the writing. So it's taken me many, many years to be able to speak in a way that people understand. And so I learned from the journalists. Fortunately, a lot of scientists are learning how to do this too. The National Science Foundation, who funds this kind of climate research, has kind of broken the old system where scientists said, I'm not going to talk to the public. I don't need to look for attention, and if they don't understand it, it's their fault. That's changing now. We realize that people need to know this stuff. And so the National Science Foundation has required now for research grants that they're judged not only on the scientific merit, but on the broader impacts to society that the work does. And they also have training programs for scientists. So I could go on and on about the techniques, but the main one is speak in plain English. If you can't say it simply as a scientist, it means you don't really understand it either. And bring it home to people on a level that makes them feel something and then makes it relevant to them. Like you're saying, it wasn't just remote polar bears, but you saw it before your eyes in Alaska, and you see it before your eyes. And tie it to the human condition. And I'd like to kind of wrap up my little piece here by saying that I've been thrilled. I feel privileged as a scientist that the work that my passion was about and my colleagues is actually being used by society, and it's permeating now the human health field because it has that, the winter sports world here. We have Aaron Merritt here doing climate justice with that. We have Elodie Link here doing youth activism from the Wild Center. So it's just wonderful to see that we don't really need to argue anymore as to whether it's real and caused by us. You can take that as rock solid science now. Let's just see what we can do with it.
And Emily, how about you? I would wager a guess that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about how can I get climate in my stories. I think you just very naturally see these as these other kinds of stories, as you did with the snowmobile. And I'll say that Speculator is south of there, which is also a big snowmobile capital, and they've had almost nothing this year. But so I'm thinking that it's more just your practice as a journalist to think in these ways of conveying information. Is that a good bet?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I will admit it's just from my personal preference. I would much rather hear a story about people than about science, and so I tend to try and fold the science in just a little bit in the middle, little clip from Kurt talking about why this really matters. And I think, to go back a little bit to the denial thing, I mean, some of the people I talked to for this Old Forge story, even though it was impacting them directly, they didn't believe that it was climate change. And
they told you this, you talked about that.
Yeah, it didn't make it into the story because, we've shifted as journalists away from having that be part of the conversation. We know the science is real, we know it's happening, and for that story, it just felt like a distraction. But I think it's important to continue to talk to those people because the story was what was happening to them, and they were willing to open up to me about their experience, and that's what matters. And one interesting thing I find when I'm approaching these kinds of stories about topics that some people, especially in the North Country, which does lean conservative in places, may find controversial, like abortion, like climate change, you have to, as a journalist, approach it with a slightly more sensitive way, because those people, I really want to talk to them. I want to talk to, a guy who owns a snowmobile rental business. I really need his perspective. I don't want to talk to, someone who is just going to preach the same thing that someone else in the story has already said. So it's really important as a journalist to get so many different perspectives. And so I approach those stories with a kind of broad approach to say, I just really want to hear what you're going through. I don't want to debate whether or not climate change is real. That's not what this story is about. I really want to know what you're seeing and what you're feeling and what you're thinking. And I think, I was actually a little bit nervous for when this story came out because I know that some people still don't believe that climate change is real. And we did get those responses online. And I don't engage those people. But the people that were part of the story, even though it was framed in a, climate change is happening and here's how it's hurting this place, they said, thank you for telling this story. This was a really good story. And we also heard from folks in the Old Forge area that backed this up, that said, yes, I've been seeing this for so long. Thank you for highlighting this. It's a really big issue here. So it's, on topics like climate change, you really do, especially in an area like the North Country, you do have to approach it in a kind of particular way to get the voices that you want.
I've done a lot of training over the years, and I used to work with a guy named David Kandow from the CBC, and David was amazing, and he had a line that was aimed at trying to highlight the importance of audio in particular, and he would say that God gave us eyelids but didn't give us earlids, and his point was that allowed audio a particular ability to get inside people. But I translate it very differently, and what the best journalism is what Emily's been describing, and it's storytelling, and it's finding ways of reaching people. The reality is people don't respond well, sorry Kurt, to numbers. That's not, if you hear a story saying in this recent issue of Science, they said blah, blah, blah. And in fact, maybe 20 years ago, I was writing a chapter for a book, and the chapter was about media and climate change, and I went to a major radio network's website that they shall go unnamed, but I thought that they covered these things the best, so that's why I was looking at their coverage. And I searched for Israel, and there's something, over a 1 month period, there's something like 150 hits. I searched for Michael Jackson, this was a while ago, and they had something like 75 hits. And I searched for climate change, there were 21 hits. In a month, they did 21 stories. 20 of those were reports on a journal article. And that, I don't think, really engages people. It lacks the context, it lacks the depth that really gets people involved. And the best storytelling, the best reporting is storytelling that gives people a reason to care. And when it comes down to it, people don't care about rocks. They don't care about numbers. They care about their neighbors. They care about their community. They care about their children. If you find a way to engage them and get them interested, this goes back to the Kandow story, is that the way I see that is then their heads open up, and then you can start pouring information in. So your clip with Kurt in the middle is a great way of now you've gotten people engaged and caring about that story, and then you can pour more information on top of that. So that's one way to deal with well, it's not a way to deal with denial, it's a way to be a good storyteller. It's the way to get people to understand information, right? Are there other, as a scientist, how do you deal with journalists to get them to understand what you're doing in a way that is effective for them and their work?
Yeah, that's it'll depend on the journalist. What I've learned is it really helps to make a personal relationship, kind of get to know each other, and also scientists need to realize that journalists work on a deadline often. Like you folks are always really, really busy, and it's neat you had time to do this, right? You had to plan in advance. So it's important to respond and give them what the main points are and sort of maybe pre-digest it a little bit like that too. But also kind of it helps to have a little bit of journalism experience too, so you kind of know what are going to be the juiciest bits to tell them as well. What's a good human story in there? Why does it matter? Why does it help us know what's happening here? So you have a few of the facts and figures to throw in, like you threw me in there as just a little snippet of a science guy to say, yes, this really is climate change, but let's get to
He's still bitter about that, apparently.
Yeah. I'm just so excited by that information, by the way. I'm totally nerding out on it and graphing it and showing my science colleagues. But this denial stuff, that's been evolving too. So the science is kind of moving on from saying, yes, we've nailed this down now. In a way, the deniers, I'd rather call them skeptics in the older days. And I was one of them, by the way, too. We didn't have the rock solid science till maybe 20 years ago, something like that. And so we went back and nailed that down and tamped it down. The denial machine that was coming from the fossil fuel industry, basically you can trace it back there, has been realizing that it's now pretty hard to deny the science. So there's a book I'd like to recommend for you if you're looking for him. It's by Michael Mann, a climate scientist who's also a good journalist. It's called The New Climate Wars. And it talked about where this denial is coming from now. It's not so much denying that the science is real, it's denying that we can do anything about it, or that it's worth trying because we've lost everything already. So some of the despair some of you may be feeling, climate despair, some of that's actually part of the strategy to paralyze you into inaction, saying it's too late. We actually do have a lot of choices to make, but that's intended to slow down legislation that would switch us from fossil fuels. So that's where a lot of the stuff, that kind of a denial is still coming from.
That's interesting. I'd not seen that element. They went from the science is wrong to now, well, the science is right, but it's not humans. It's all natural variability.
Or they'll say it's too late. No, we've already wrecked it, so why bother switching from fossil fuels? The planet's all going to burn up anyway, so let's get rich.
Well, that's uplifting. Yeah, appreciate that. Emily, so
Sorry, I'm learning how to talk in plain English.
and it's depressing. Emily, so well, actually, a question, follow-up to that was, do you ever, when talking to a reporter, do you ever say, that's really not the story. What you really might want to think of is over here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we shouldn't leave me on that depressing note. I'm glad you brought that up, because the real story is there's a lot of hope. Because we do still have a choice. We can switch from fossil fuels, and there are lots of really good reasons to do it, economic, social, whatever. We're eventually going to run out, so let's do it in advance. But we get these side benefits of saving the climate and all that too. So we still have time to make the change, and we can absolutely do it. And I'm hopeful because of what I said about the science permeating the culture, the social justice, the youth activism is incredible. And I think it's actually happening. Even the fossil fuel companies are investing in alternative energy right now, quietly, because why not? We're going to make money off it later. So I actually think we can turn it around, and I think that's the story, is don't be distracted by the despair stories, because they're really not right. All is not lost. And I can vouch for that as a scientist too.
Remember that brief iteration of BP, Beyond Petroleum,
Yeah.
and how quickly that disappeared.
Yeah.
Emily, what do you want to hear from scientists and from people that helps inform your work? That's a weird question, I know. It's a tough one.
Well, I mean, it's always helpful to just hear from people and what they're seeing. We're always interested in folks reaching out to us, which they do a lot, about, what's going on in their communities, what they're seeing on the ground. I want to give a little shout out to Kurt, because for this Old Forge story, I was on a really tight deadline for NPR, and I messaged him and I said, Kurt, can you meet me at 7 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning? And he did. I went over to his house and he gave me a quick 5-minute interview, and I was able to meet that deadline. So working with scientists like Kurt, who are able to really convey the message in very clear language, because sometimes, not all scientists are trained in that way, and you have to go through a 30-minute interview, which doesn't sound like that long, but when you're working on deadline, it really is a long time. And then I have to kind of parse through, what did they really say, what was really important, and I don't have that background. So I think getting scientists trained better, continuing that effort to get them to communicate better with the public is really helpful. And turning those studies into, more human-focused studies, which Kurt just published a study, I think it was in the fall or early winter, and it ended with this really human focus, that this, climate change is really going to impact our culture here. It's not just about the flora and fauna, it's about the snowmobiling and the skiing and hosting the World University Games. I mean, that's what's at stake here, along with so much else. But I think really continuing that shift towards telling the climate change stories from a human perspective is really the way forward.
And this is why this part of the conversation is so important, is that I don't know the exact numbers now. I used to. I don't have off the top of my head, but in the last 20 years, the number of journalists lost in this country is tremendous. It's tens of thousands of journalists that are no longer out there reporting. Many small communities don't have a newspaper anymore. This is why North Country Public Radio is such an amazing resource for you guys.
I mean, if you live in the Adirondacks, you are very lucky, and not just for North Country Public Radio, but we have the Adirondack Daily Enterprise, which is a great local paper. You've got the Adirondack Explorer, which they've got multiple Adirondack reporters, a water reporter, a policy reporter. We are incredibly lucky if we live here in the Adirondacks for the kind of journalism that we have on the ground. So if you remember anything from this talk, it's support local journalism, subscribe to your local paper. Those are the people that are on the ground every day. We live in your communities. We care about your neighbors. We are your neighbors. And yeah, we want to keep telling these stories, and it's kind of rare to live in a place that has so many outlets that are local and want to tell these stories.
And I've been a subscriber of Adirondack Explorer for more than 20 years, and I should have mentioned them too. They are the other amazing outlet. The others are good, but those are the ones I know really intimately, and they're awesome. But I raise this because of this dynamic between reporters and scientists now is critically important, because with that loss of journalists, there are much smaller numbers of journalists who are really familiar with environmental science, with climate science, and can report from that perspective. So it's even more important for people like Kurt to have these conversations with journalists. But I also want to talk about a lot of, just briefly, what people like you in the audience can do. If you're knowledgeable in some area, and I've heard some people introduced who work in an area that gives them immense knowledge, you know, begin to have conversations with journalists. Journalists are not offended if you call, they might not have much time, but if you call up and say, hey, I'd like to take you to lunch. They always like free food if you buy them lunch. but I'd like to take you to lunch and talk about my work, just so they know a little bit more. And as Kurt said, it's good to build relationships. It's hard on deadline to talk to a reporter and gain that trust that you need to really have a good conversation. One of the reasons Emily goes to Kurt is he's an amazing scientist and does really important work here. Paul Hay is another one that does that as well. But another reason she goes to him is they know each other, they have a relationship. She knows that he's going to be honest and trustworthy, and she can respect the work that he does. And this is important. Also, if you're just an average listener to North Country Public Radio and you hear something you like, call and tell them. Let them know that you appreciate what's going on. I'm not saying this as, oh, let's support public radio, but simply that reporters often are out there in a vacuum. If they don't know that you valued this story, and you talked about people who the feedback that you got, that's important. It's important for the journalists and important for the bosses to hear. If the gatekeepers hear more people saying they want these stories, they're eventually going to acquiesce and start putting more of these stories on the air. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left or less. So are there questions? We can talk about this all afternoon, but the questions. Aaron, good to see you here.
Yes, it's an honor to be here, and I really, really appreciate this conversation. This is probably one of the most essential we had here. A little side note, because I think we don't have a venue like this auditorium down at the Stadium 33 Center down here.
I'm not sure, but they're going to bring your microphone over real quickly so the people streaming can actually hear as well. Your voice scares wonderfully, but...
But the reason why I asked about the stadium below, because I think I gave a talk there about a decade ago, and I was thinking about the proximity to the athletes and their ability to attend a conversation like this. I mean, not only is it important to have this, and I'm really thankful for this venue that we're having this conversation, but also we want to talk about the issue of access of athletes too, so they can, between sports or whatever, be in and drift out. I want to get to the point that you raised earlier. I believe it was Emily, or again, Dale, it might have been you, with regards to the old ownerships and the old model where the editor was the person that you had to convince was a worthwhile story. And that'll still allow the Exxons of the world to bury high the story and play to both sides of the game. And I'm looking at the evolution right now where I'm seeing you going from that, the editors who are, controlling telling the story, to like the Sinclair News, which is really, as they say, harmonizing that corporate message. I'm not sure whether any of you saw about 3 years ago the Sinclair, and I think it's on YouTube, mashup of all of their affiliates, which were across NBC, CBS, ABC, and they all read the same message. And somebody did a mashup of showing that how the message is controlled. To right now with the Elon Musk of the world, where they own the story. So we got this crisis, and it's filtering now through the culture war lens. And the science is not changing. So they're now, as I say, the corporate activism by the actual owners and the Tiffany Crosses, who are just totally removed from even having a voice or even telling a segment of society's voice. I say that to say this: must you not lean forward more so, Emily and Dale, in your skis? And I mean, we don't have the glacial time to sit there and get all these little nice nuanced little stories. That William Faulkner period, in my opinion, is passé. I think as the crisis is accelerating, do we not need to lead forward and, as I say, really push back? Because again, it's not as simple as people calling in and putting pressure and they'll change the story. That's not true. With the Elon Musk model of the world, your story's not going to get it. In fact, they're doing their best to take good reporters like Tiffany Cross off the air so that they can stop the message and push their message.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Aaron, and thanks for bringing it up. I will admit that when Dale asked me to be part of this panel, I was a little embarrassed because I'm not a climate reporter and I don't do enough climate stories. And it is hard. I'm one reporter for a station and I cover a 6 million acre park, just me. So every story can't be a climate story, but I will just acknowledge this. I mean, it's true. I should, and so many other reporters should be doing more climate stories. And it's easier for us on the local level because we're not part of, that kind of Sinclair, that, larger entity that owns so many different outlets around the country. And again, this is why we're so lucky here. We have so many different independent outlets. I think it's harder at the national level because there is so much more focus on politics. I mean, it's, you turn the radio on in this morning and it's all about documents, Biden's documents and Trump's documents. That's the conversation. And it is really hard to kind of get in there and say, hey, here's this thing that's happening. So it's easier on the local level. And yes, we should, all the journalists around here should be doing more climate stories. It's true.
There's a lot of layers in there. One is, I love the image of leaning forward in your skis because when I ski, I tend to go back too far and fall a lot. So this is an important message for me to hear in many realms of my life. But I don't think it's an either or. We need these lifestyle contextual stories that help us understand the world around us and that really engage people. But you're right, we need more of the broader stuff too. I've said for a long time, and having spent 20 years in Washington working for NPR, CBS, and CNN, back when CNN did news, I've said that to me, the argument about whether it's leftist or rightist is the wrong approach. You have that, but to me, what's more important in the national media is it's an elitist ruling class worldview. And that excludes a lot of the stuff that we're talking about by nature. And that's not well, I guess it is a criticism of the people doing this stuff, but it's a bubble in Washington. It's really hard to break through that and change the way they cover news. I can't tell you how many times I was working someplace and a story would come up and it wasn't a good story, but they go, oh, the New York Times has it, or CNN has it, so we've got to do it. And it's that insular, I call it intellectual incest that happens in Washington a lot that leads to the exclusion of a lot of this sort of stuff, if that makes sense. That's why local media is so important, because local media can do this. They have the ability, and they have reporters like Emily who may not, I don't even know if you have much of a science background in your education, but you're a good reporter and you can make sense of this and you can convey it in a way that engages the public. And that's really what the most important thing is. And in doing so, you can do not the doom and gloom stories, although that's important, but you can put it in the context to adaptation. Managed retreat stories. I heard something recently, yesterday, right, driving up here, and I can't remember who it was, but they had a great story. Oh, it was on Terry Gross. It was on Fresh Air, which surprised me. It was a produced piece, and they talked about management retreat for flooding. Because right now we have flood insurance and people live in these places that are marginal at best for surviving major storms. Their houses get knocked down, they get the flood insurance, they can build back. Well, management retreat says that they can get the money, but they can't build back in that area. And so we slowly remove the risk. My friend Andy Revkin talks a lot about what he calls the changing bullseye. A lot of the damage we're seeing now is not, it may be caused by climate change, but more importantly, it's caused by our expansion into these areas that are more marginal and more at risk, whether it be in the woods out west and all the houses that went up with the wildfires. There's a lot of technology now, different siding, other things that can be done to prevent houses from going up in flames. But one of the best things is you don't build right in the middle of the woods and have trees right up to your house and then expect when a wildfire comes for your house to survive. So anyway, I'm rambling on here a bit, but these are kinds of stories that we should be hearing more of nationally. But if we're not, we need to do them a lot more locally. I don't know if you have any response as well.
Yeah, I guess we're just about out of time, but I did want to give you another uplifting story too. I like to see how the science is evolving and taking care of the land is evolving too. And I'll just throw one quick hopeful example too is the Nature Conservancy is building long-term climate change here in the Adirondacks into the management of this beautiful lake near Tupper Lake. It's called Follinsby Pond, where Ralph Waldo Emerson had his philosopher's camp. So it's of great historical importance, but it's also important ecologically because it's about 200 feet deep and it's really big. So there's this giant reservoir of cold water down below that lake trout like to live in. And lake trout are in danger across North America because of the warming and other issues. So in addition to just preserving Follinsby Pond because of Emerson, the Nature Conservancy is also going to manage it as a climate refuge for lake trout. So things like that, I think, are another sign of hope that this is permeating the culture really and kind of pulling us all together, because we really do need everybody to pull this off. And I'm sure we can, and we're making great progress towards that.
And that's a great story. You can reach through fishermen, you can reach people who recreate in the water. And so again, from a journalistic standpoint, it's a great story to be told. All right, we are out of time. One more question?
Yes.
Please.
My name is Lovisa Broms, and I'm representing the Swedish University Sports Federation. And thank you for a great conversation, very, very interesting. And I'm curious about the gatekeeping concept and the shifting landscape of media today, and actually the role of the sport organizations, because we're talking about utilizing local media, of course also science, but what can we do as sport organizations, as also gatekeepers through new media channels? Should we utilize local media more, or do you have any thoughts on that note? Thanks.
From a sports organization, being able to become sources, talk to the reporters, become a trusted source with them, so they come to you, and when they have a story, when they're thinking, they can come to you. You know, I worked at Ohio State University, go Bucks, a long time ago in a way previous lifetime. I didn't hear any applause for the Bucks. There might be a reason for that. But I worked with a guy in there. He was their science guy, PR guy in the school, and Earl Holland is his name, and he's an amazing guy. And he became a legend because everybody came to Earl, because they would come to him and say, I'm looking for an expert to do a story on X. And he'd say, well, we've got this person. But sometimes he'd say, you know, we've got this person who's doing that, but if you really, for what you want that real expert, you know, they're at UC Santa Barbara, or he would never say Michigan, but he would say, you know, some of the other schools. But he was a trusted source not only for the information he would provide, but he would help the reporter and guide them to the best people for them to talk to. So I would encourage that sort of activity. And, you know, having lists of stories to provide to news outlets that they might want to cover. One of the, you know, I forgot about this. When I did my master's thesis, I did a survey of television news gatekeepers. And the result was, to me, what I call my, you know, duh moment, which was after setting up this whole matrix that they had to answer to determine on very clearly what their environmental knowledge was, not just asking them, but actually having responses that were required that would indicate what their environmental knowledge was. The final result was very simple. The gatekeepers with higher levels of scientific knowledge put more environmental stories on the air. So that says to me, one of our biggest roles is to help educate gatekeepers about these stories. And you're in a position where you can do that. So in Toronto, they had for a while, I've not been able to find out if it's still on, they had a great program once a month. It was called Breakfast with Eggheads. And they would go to the government bodies, and they would offer them breakfast, all the legislators and everybody else, like 8 in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, free food, and a conversation about some science topic. And they found that correlated with an increased interest in legislation about these issues that were based on science. You could do something similarly. For any reporters in your area who cover sports issues, you can have a regular gathering, invite them over. No pressure, not pitching a story, just want to give you background information to help your knowledge that you can do better reporting in the future on those things. So there are a lot of those sorts of things that groups like you can do. But the number one thing is develop those relationships. You know, Kurt's amazing, but these journalists wouldn't know it if they didn't develop a relationship that they could find out how amazing he is. And that, to me, is like the number one thing to do, is create those relationships. I also want to throw up, by the way, one quick thing, and that is a reminder that this stuff is being streamed. I feel sorry for the guys who sit down here with the camera in front of us for the whole thing, holding up that camera. But my understanding is these being archived, too. So you can send this out to other people who might be interested and weren't able to be here today, to let them know about that. And with that, I think we're done. So thank you all for being here, and lunch.
Thank you. Let's give him another round of applause, please. Bravo to my colleagues in journalism. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Dr. Steger, and thank you, Emily Russell. All right, and I can tell you for sure, their words are absolutely true. Relationships are everything, even in the media, what have you. Relationships are so important, so make sure you continue to strike those and keep them warm. Conversation is important.